The first of the ancient infectious diseases that we'll talk about is schistosomiasis. It's a parasitic disease. When we talk about a parasitic disease, what we're talking about is that the organism lives in you and causes harm. We have a lot of organisms that live in us and don't cause us harm or even give us benefits, but parasites cause harm. And schistosomiasis is caused by a parasite. It's a type of worm called a flatworm, and it belongs to the genus Schistosoma. We will see in image on the next slide a cartoon of what those look like. What happens with the infection with schistosoma is that the worm has a number of different life stages. And one of the life stages is as a larva. So it's not the adult, it's more of a juvenile stage. And this juvenile stage can actually burrow directly into the skin when people are in water. For example, if you're swimming or bathing or even just cooling off your feet, the larvae can burrow into your skin. Once in there, in the body, they'll go to different places. For example, they can get into the urinary tract system. And when the parasite is in the urinary tract system, as you might imagine, that could damage things like the bladder, the ureters, and the kidneys. When the parasites get even deeper into your body, like into your intestines, they affect not only the intestines themselves, but they can affect organs like the liver and spleen, causing them to get bigger, which is not a healthy state to be in. They can cause physical damage to the intestines. As you think about it, these parasites are burrowing through your body, so the fact that they cause damage is not necessarily surprising. And they can cause hypertension or high blood pressure in the blood vessels of the abdomen. And high blood pressure can be dangerous because when you have such pressure on your blood vessels, that can eventually cause them to get weaker and maybe even burst through an aneurysm. So this parasite, once it gets in the body, can do a lot of damage. What we're looking at here is the life cycle of the organism. It's a complex life cycle. I am not going to ask you to remember any really of the steps of this life cycle, but what you're looking at is that one larval form burrows into the human skin. Depending on which species of schistosome we're talking about, sometimes they prefer to go different places. The one labeled A likes to go specifically to the small intestine, B likes to go to the large intestine, and then C likes to go to the bladder. So it really depends on the species itself, where it prefers to go. And then the two species that like to go to the intestines are shed generally in the feces. The third can sometimes, that's what this little line indicates, sometimes be shed in the feces, but the one that goes to the bladder is most commonly going to be shed in the urine. It's going to be passed out into the urine. Every once in a while, one of the other species, the one that goes to the small intestine, can also come out into the urine. When the form comes out into the urine, it turns into a different larval form. It burrows into a snail, it replicates in the snail, it bursts out of the snail and goes back into the person. So again, it's that complex life cycle. And for people who live in areas where they aren't able to filter water and they only have access to this type of contaminated water, contaminated by urine or feces, then you can see how this would perpetuate in that population. And of course, back in the ancient days, they didn't have filtered water and they didn't really have, indoor plumbing or anything. At best, maybe you had chamber pots, or everybody could use almost like an outhouse that dropped into basically the water supply. So it would continually have these types of organisms in the water. Some of the evidence that this parasite was around in ancient times and causing symptoms came from mummies of the ancient Nubians or any other ancient civilization, that what they found was in the skin of these mummies, they found proteins belonging to one of the schistosomes, indicating that the mummies may have been infected with this parasite. Another organism that was fairly common and still is common, but not usually in the US, is Salmonella. So Salmonella is a bacterium that is passed in feces. As you might imagine, in those areas that don't have great sanitation, such as in ancient cities or places that don't have the same infrastructure like we do in the US, Salmonella infections could be far more common. One of the most dangerous types of a Salmonella infection is caused by Salmonella typhi. It's called typhoid fever. The symptoms are pretty similar to any gastrointestinal infection: diarrhea, fever, abdominal pain, anywhere from 12 to 72 hours after initial infection. This is not a classic 24-hour bug. This is one you're going to feel for a few days. The illness will last anywhere from 4 to 7 days. However, most people do recover even without treatment. Think about the last time that you had an illness after eating food. Maybe you had these same symptoms of diarrhea, fever, and cramping. You most likely didn't see the doctor unless you started to feel really dehydrated, you ran a really long high fever, or it lasted for a long time. So most healthy individuals can recover from these infections pretty easily. However, anyone who's elderly, infants, or people who have impaired immune systems can have a more severe disease. And that's what you're seeing in the bottom panel here. This is clearly a child, and the infection has caused systemic issues. This could be an example of like septic shock. The fingers are swollen and red. So it's gone through the body. When we talk about a plague, the one that was called the Plague of Athens, this was in Greece during the Peloponnesian War. What happened was a lot of these cities, or they were called like city-states, had walls to protect them. So they were these walled city-states. And so Athens was a walled city-state. And when the Athenians were hiding from the Spartans, they hid in their, well, they didn't hide, but they were in their city behind the wall to help protect themselves. When you have situations where people are all trapped in a very small area, you have a breeding ground for disease, especially when you can't remove your waste products and you don't have access to clean water. With this particular plague of Athens, it is hard to tell what specifically was causing the infection. The reason I include it here is because some scientists think that it may have been typhoid. Other scientists think it might have been a different infection called typhus. So typhus is an infection caused by a different kind of bacteria called rickettsia, and these bacteria are transmitted by things like fleas and body lice. When you have people living in close quarters without the ability to engage in proper hygiene, body lice are super common. And when you have people that live in cities, you have storage of food, you probably have things like mice and rats, which carry fleas that can also transmit this disease. A Greek historian who actually suffered from this plague and then recovered described the symptoms and the social consequences. The bodies of dying men lay one upon another, and half-dead creatures reeled about in the streets. The catastrophe became so overwhelming that men cared nothing for any rule of religion or law. When you have disease outbreak like this and there is no way to avoid it, there's no way to get rid of it, society can really fall apart. Some of you may have heard of typhus. Typhus was one of the really common infections that victims of the concentration camps during World War II suffered. It's thought that this is probably what Anne Frank died of. If you've read the Diary of Anne Frank, it's thought that she died of typhus in the concentration camps. So when people are kept in very tight quarters and unable to clean themselves or to live in a clean environment, these diseases can spread. Typhoid, you may have heard of Typhoid Mary. It does exist in the US. Again, it's not terribly common because we do have sanitation, proper food preparation. So this is a timeline of Typhoid Mary. And of course, you can read this at your convenience, and I'll just kind of summarize it for you. So the woman was named Mary Mallon. She worked as a cook. And as she was working in this home, a visitor came to the home who had typhoid. So he or she had salmonella infection. Mary got the infection. It's pretty common that with an infection like this, if one person in the house has it, other people in the house will get it because, you're exposed to the same things when you live in the same home. So she got typhoid. Another employee of the family got typhoid. But they all recovered. And then Mary got a job with a different family, and in that family, more people got typhoid, so she left. Then she started working as a cook for a different family, and it's believed that she started a waterborne outbreak of typhoid that killed about 1,300 people. She moved again, started cooking. Within 3 weeks, more people got typhoid. She moved again, people got typhoid. She moved again, people got typhoid. She finally changed her name and started working again, people got typhoid. And finally, the New York City Health Department tracked her down, and she didn't want to cooperate. They wanted to test her for the presence of the bacteria. So at this point, scientists could look at things under the microscope. They knew about bacteria. We didn't have all that complicated genetic analysis, but they could look at a stool sample and identify that there were bacteria in it that may be pathogens. So there are some areas, even today, and this was even more true back in the early 1900s, where you can be arrested for failing to comply with the health department. So she refused to comply with the health department. She was arrested. They did run the tests on her stool sample and found that she was shedding the typhoid bacteria. So she had no symptoms. She didn't have diarrhea, no fever. This had been years, and she's shedding this bacteria still. What we know now is that the bacteria can colonize the gallbladder. So it can live inside of the gallbladder indefinitely. So people who have recovered from the infection can still constantly shed the bacteria in their feces, even though they don't experience any symptoms. At this point, there were no antibiotics. And the only treatment that's available to get rid of the infection is to remove her gallbladder. And she says no, she absolutely will not have her gallbladder taken out. And so they don't forcibly do the surgery on her, but they do keep her in detention. And they test her periodically for having the bacteria. And so she had been imprisoned for a few years. And then finally, the public was outraged. She's not sick. She's just a carrier. You're threatening her with a life-altering surgery of having her gallbladder removed. So public pressure led to her to be released. And she promised, if you let me go, I promise, I will never, ever, ever work as a cook again. Promise. Well, you can imagine maybe where this is going. A few years later, at a hospital in New York City, doctors and nurses died of typhoid. And then the cook went out and did not come back. And it turns out the cook was Mary. She had changed her name again. And she says, basically, being a cook is the only job I like. I'm going to be a cook, and you can't really stop me. So, yeah, they can. They arrested her again. And when she got arrested, I kid you not, she's like, "Oh, hey, do y'all need a cook?" And of course they were like, no, we don't want to die. She will not have the surgery. She refuses to stop working as a cook. And so she is imprisoned for the rest of her life. And not in prison, but she's held forcefully in a hospital. Like, they won't let her go. So in practice, technically, I guess she was imprisoned. She was not able to be released ever again. So she was quarantined for the rest of her life. It's really interesting to think about the ethics of that. Had she committed a crime? I'm not familiar with New York state law, and I'm certainly not familiar with New York state law back in the early 1900s, but is it a crime to be a carrier of a bacterial infection or any infection? Is it a crime to pass an infection to other people? Is it a crime to pass it to other people when you know that that's the possibility? I have my own opinion as to what the answers to those questions might be, and perhaps you might have your own opinion as well. But there are some states in the US where, for example, if you knowingly expose a person to HIV without their consent, you can be arrested for that. And you can also be forcibly held and treated for tuberculosis. So again, it's something for you to think about. Those of you who are, going to be graduating, entering the workforce, becoming, informed members of the public. What do you think about these types of situations?